Okay, so my name is Haniel Carl, and you're listening to the Creative Independence Podcast. I'm here today with Jesse James. Welcome, Jesse.
Thanks, Daniel. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, so this is the first episode of the podcast, as you know, and I like to start things off with where I first saw like one of your videos first, which was with the video with Dan Coe. Then I watched Talon Simmons and this other guy, which I forgot the name again. But it was on consciousness, and it seems like you've been going with your podcast for a while, and recently it has taken off a bit more, I'd say. But it wasn't always like this, right? You call yourself a woodcarver or Jesse James Carver. So how did a woodcarver become a podcaster and a content creator?
I like the question. Yes, so I've been a woodcarver for 6 or 7 years now, and I started off more as a woodworker, so joinery, using a full-on wood shop to create um, a variety of different types of projects, such as here's a mallet that I made a few years ago, and
That's
I
it.
really enjoy working with wood. It's a beautiful medium.
Yeah.
And what I discovered was that with carving, it's very contemplative and
Hmm.
it can be a lot quieter than running all the machines in a wood shop. So I can sit at home instead of having to travel somewhere with a big dust collector and all the machines. I can just sit and contemplate and chip away with my carving tools. And so I've really been enjoying that process. And I've been a writer for a long time as well, but didn't necessarily take it very seriously. And I conducted some interviews for print, so for a magazine or for a newspaper. And I had some great opportunities, like interviewing Dr. Wade Davis, an anthropologist, very incredible storyteller. And that opened some other doors for me. And then after a few years of this whole woodworking endeavor, I discovered that my original intent to make it a business was much more difficult than I originally supposed.
Hmm.
And it was kind of frustrating to try to make things that I really loved making and then put a price tag that someone would actually pay.
Yeah.
It was kind of disheartening to sell things on the market of, what are people willing to pay versus
Yeah.
what do I think it's worth and how much time and how much love did I put into it. And so in recent years, I've sort of let go of the desire for my woodworking to make me an income and just made it my craft. And then when I discovered Dan Coe about maybe 20 months ago now, he helped me understand how if you're going to create content online, you don't have to start by niching down. You can start by exploring the synergy of your variety of interests. And for me, a big struggle has always been the fact that I have so many interests.
Hmm.
So as a young man, and we can get into all these different branches, but from age 10 to 15, I was a magician, and I put on hundreds of magic shows along with my dad, and we made money doing that. And then I moved on from magic because I had so many other interests. I had uh, a fondness for photography. I started video editing and doing special effects for a little while. And I just branched into so many different things. And then when I graduated from high school and was expected to get a job, and I landed at a fast food restaurant for a while, I didn't find it very satisfying, to say the least.
Yeah.
And so all these years later, when Dan helped me to understand that first off, it's very powerful to start a newsletter because not only do people start potentially paying attention to your writing, but you get to collect an email list, and then that can be repurposed, right? You can pivot. If you started off writing about, let's say, wood carving, and there's a few people interested in that, but you also want to write about, you know, one of my interests would be like botany or plants and ecology. And that kind of ties in, right? Because a woodworker uses a material that comes from trees. And
Yeah.
so suddenly someone who thought, oh, this woodworking guy is kind of interesting, they're also now reading about my interest in plants and trees. Just as an example, I haven't really written much about botany, but one
Yeah.
of my interests. And so because Dan helped me realize you could do that, it gave me the drive to get started. And I created this topic tree on paper of all these interests of mine. And I also have loved to explore philosophical ideas and traditions, such as Taoism and Zen Buddhism. And there's this concept in Zen known as the uncarved block.
Hmm.
And so it just struck me one night. I was up late, I couldn't sleep. And so it was 1 a.m, and I got up and I got a pen and paper and started writing. And I thought, oh, I'm not going to stop woodworking. I love woodworking, so that's just going to be part of my life for this foreseeable future. And I would like to keep exploring these topics of philosophical intrigue. And somehow it just came to me, this idea that, oh, I'll title my newsletter The Unblocked Carver, flipping the terms of the uncarved block. And it just really fit together nicely. I saw that the unblocked carver sort of represented the same thing that the uncarved block does. Or in some sense, it represents the opposite, because the
Yeah.
uncarved block
Yeah.
is like unmanifest potential. It's like all of the potential that hasn't yet been carved. And the unblocked carver is like my journey to become creatively unblocked. And also, I have an interest in Jungian psychology, and Jung talked a lot about his idea of individuation,
Yes.
which is sort of like the development of the ego self toward the soul. You know, so the identity that we have is sort of only like a fragment of the true self in a way. And to move toward the calling of the soul is sort of to become more whole. And so that all sort of fits together. Hopefully I've described that nicely, that the unblocked carver allowed me to write about all these topics, but with the central thesis being you are on a journey that is a calling of your soul. And if you answer that call, it will unblock your creative power.
Nice. Nice. It's like it's almost like the unblocked creator or the unblocked carver is kind of like the mission, right? And like the uncarved block is kind of like the first problem or the first kind of inciting incident almost that kind of sends you in this journey. That's amazing. Yeah. I really like this concept of kind of unfulfilled potential because it's something that really resonates with me. And I think it kind of resonates with a lot of creators because when you were telling me about your story, I couldn't help but like find some similarities in a sense of having multiple interests, of trying a lot of different things and not knowing how it all fits together. And I always find in creators that there's always like this thing that sends them on this journey to become a creator, to fulfill their own potential. What was that thing for you? Was it a specific event, or was it mostly the job that you didn't like? What was the thing that kind of made you go in this journey of knowing yourself and fully developing your potential?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, a lot of it had to do with pain and suffering. So I've had a lot of jobs. After the fast food, I moved on, and I had a job that was actually quite exciting and insightful, which was a door-to-door sales job. And I worked for a guy who was starting up this lawn care company. And so, the company would do aeration and moss removal and reseeding and all the main things to take care of people's lawns. And so I learned a bit about sales, and also because the job was commission based, it was a very different experience than making a wage. It was more the incentive to do well at the job was if you don't do well, you don't get paid.
Yeah.
And so I had to go and knock on doors, and some people just closed the door. And others maybe would be friendly and talkative, but they didn't care about their lawn. And so I had to learn a lot about reading people, and I had to learn a lot about maintaining my own inner state. Because when you face a lot of rejection, it can be discouraging. And yet you have to go knock on the next door and be in a good positive state, because maybe this person wants lawn care and they don't want to buy it from someone who's all upset about the last door they knocked on. So learning how to cultivate that positive state from within was very powerful. But that was a seasonal job, and it passed. And then I had other jobs. I've been a dishwasher. I've been a caretaker for adults with disabilities, and I've been many different things. I've worn a lot of different hats. And ever since high school, I've also faced this problem of chronic pain, physical pain in my back.
Really?
And it was always kind of a mystery to me. And, it partly might be that I wasn't super active as a young man. I was into books and I was into computers. Yeah. So lots of time sitting at a desk and not that conscious of my posture. That probably didn't help. And then I've also learned quite a bit about the mind-body interconnection and how emotional stuff can be involved in chronic pain.
Yes.
And so I've had a fair bit of healing. There's still more to do. But because of that pain, most jobs, even without the pain, they might have been dissatisfying. I might have been frustrated that they weren't very fulfilling. But then add the pain on top of that, and half of the time they were almost unbearable. And so I spent basically close to a decade of my life very, very frustrated. And I knew from being a childhood magician that there was another way to live, and people showed me entrepreneurship is one of the pathways you can take in life. But it's not generally encouraged by our culture. It's more so, it's a courageous path, because you're told basically that if you want security in life, you should go to school and have a career, or get some kind of stable job with job security. And basically that became unfeasible for me. And so I suspect that there was always that creative impulse in my heart that I was never going to be satisfied with a traditional career path, let's say. And so in a way, maybe that physical pain was a gift from my soul calling me to something more, to say, look, you can't stay on this path of staying small. You have to pursue what's in your heart. So it's partly out of necessity.
Yeah. I can relate to that. I for sure can. I have a concept that kind of fits this idea which I called the splinter in the mind. It's a concept from The Matrix. And I kind of use it to describe how there's always something a bit off with us about how we see the world or how we feel about life. And I think for creative people, that can become unbearable and can even manifest in disease, chronic pains, and destructive habits as well. And at least for me, I struggled with autoimmune disease for like 2 years straight, almost died. And I was always kind of creative as well, but I couldn't fit in. So would you say that it's partly then not being able to fit in a normal structure, let's say, but there's always a thing that kind of sends you off on this journey? That's kind of what happens with a lot of creators in your experience.
Yeah. You know what? To be honest with you, it always sort of confused me to look around. Like, one of my last jobs was in a cabinet shop. And I kind of enjoyed it to some extent because it was using some of my woodworking skills. And you can build quite a few cabinets in a day when you're working with a team. It wasn't really creative. I was just building according to the plans that were given to me for the customers. But I looked around me and I saw people who they had accepted this completely as a career path. And I don't want to sound like I'm judging them, because I'm actually quite happy for them if that's fulfilling enough and then gives them the freedom to do what they want in life. That's fantastic.
Yes.
But it confused me because I couldn't stay in that path. And so I didn't understand, like, how are you all happy to just, party or play games on the weekend instead of trying to get out of this situation?
Yeah.
And just going back to work. So, yeah, I couldn't really fit in because I probably sometimes annoyed people with my deeper questions. And not everyone wants to ask those deeper questions, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But I had to.
Yeah. It's almost like funny looking from the outside. Because like most people look at creators and they think, oh, he must be so talented or so creative, but they don't understand that it's almost like a survival coping mechanism. It's like you cannot really live any other way. You know what I mean? Unless you become destructive or kind of adrift in life. And that, I think, can become a very dangerous path, and in my opinion is kind of the source of many problems in society and in the world in general. It's like this unfulfilled potential, or the uncarved block, as you say, that kind of bothers people so much that they have to latch onto something, and that something usually means giving up one's creative independence. And that's kind of where things can become a bit structural, because there's a system kind of built around this, right? So my question is, how have you been able kind of to do this transition from working a normal job and not exactly fitting in and feeling this creative urge to becoming a creator? And are you a full-time creator, you could say, right now?
it's been a struggle. So I've I've still had to pursue a variety of different kinds of work, whether it's freelance, doing a bit of web design, or sort of like a form of, almost like a form of counseling, you know, being a supporter for people who are in a searching mode, and maybe they don't quite want to go to therapy, and I'm not a therapist, so I can't
Yeah.
offer that. But I've offered guidance of different kinds to people, and yeah, I'm still figuring it out, and I'm very lucky that for one, I have very supportive friends, and I have very supportive parents. So I've lived in a lot of since I first moved out of my parents' house. I've lived in a lot of different situations. I lived in a camper van at one point for a summertime. I've lived in like
Really?
a renovated suite upstairs of a barn. And a lot of these situations weren't very good. Um, Moving in with girlfriends a couple of times when I shouldn't have. And so it's been a very unstable previous decade. And now I'm in this position where the place I'm living in, my parents bought, and so I rent it from them, but they give me a very good deal. And in fact, sometimes right now they're even helping me buy groceries. So I don't want to put up a facade and tell people that I've made it. I'm fighting for my dear life, and
Yeah.
I will make it one way or another.
Yeah.
But I read a piece that you wrote that had a lot to do with facing mortality,
Yes.
and it really spoke to me because I've always felt acutely aware of the passage of time. And when I heard people older than me say, time will fly by, I didn't think, oh, you know, you just didn't pay attention, or you're just old now or something. It's like, no, they know something.
Yeah.
It really does pass you by. And so there's kind of some grief in that. If I imagine the block being left uncarved, I don't want to be at the end of my life and having not poured it all out to do something meaningful. And partly that's like fulfilling my potential, but it's partly, I mean, I would have to ask, well, what does that mean to fulfill my potential, to be who I want to be? It's not just a matter of like how much money I can make, or, you know, what fancy things I can purchase. It's also like, who am I to other people? What impact do I have on this world before I depart? And so, because I've really looked at that, it's like I have such a powerful anti-vision
Mm.
that I'm okay with this struggle more than I'm okay with making a lofty wage and having security in order to not struggle.
Yeah.
I would rather struggle. So my goal is to be a full-time creator. I have a few goals. You know, we're doing this event in this June that we can talk about, which is designed to empower more and more creators. And I've been blessed with this opportunity to pull together some really incredible people like Dan Coe to put on this event. But also, and this event may or may not be profitable. The potential of it is for it to be quite profitable. But I also want to make money from spending more time carving down the road. I just don't want to rush to make it a business. I would rather be in the position where every once in a while, it's sort of like the idea of 1,000 true fans. Uh, I can't remember who came up with that concept, but the
Is
idea
it Brett
that,
Flynn?
okay, yeah, like
Yeah. Is it?
if you have 1,000 true fans, you can run a 6 to 7 figure business on that if you have the right product. And so there's some company that they only make like 1,000 pairs of jeans a year or something, but they're like really high quality, well loved jeans, and so they have a steady, good income from it. So my idea would be like, can I make pieces of furniture that you can't buy anywhere in the world except from me? And if you happen to have, $1 million or $10 million house and you want a custom coffee table, oh, Jesse James Carver will do it for you. He'll spend 2 months of his life making your coffee table. I would like to do that, but then I have to charge, $20,000 or $30,000 for the table. And most people in my position would never purchase a $20,000 table. So it's kind of unrelatable when you're getting started as an artist. It's like, oh, I have to charge this small amount that people will pay, because a lot of us, we don't know people who would spend that amount. But I have met people who would. And so that's shifted my worldview a little bit to understand that some people value that enough, because having a beautiful home is actually quite significant to many people. Like, I don't have a ton of money, but there's a $300 Afghani rug on my wall. And some people would think I'm silly for purchasing a $300 rug. And I think it's such a beautiful rug. It ends up in the background of most of my podcasts, and it adds to how I feel at home. And so I know that someone who has millions of dollars is quite happy to support an artist to receive something that they're going to love having in their home. But yeah, that's one of my goals, among others, is to make a good income doing the things that I really love doing, but also to feel like I'm giving something beautiful to the world. And so that's where I'm at right now. It's just an uphill climb, and the podcast as well hasn't made me money, but it has opened doors, it's opened opportunities, and it's been immensely enjoyable to have conversations with people I'm interested in. So
Yeah, but I think it's important for people to understand that not everything happens overnight, right? And I like to see real creators like that are struggling and that are building towards something, because you will always kind of struggle, right? You just have to be conscious enough to kind of pick what you will struggle for, sort of, if it makes any sense.
This is true.
But what are some other interests of you that kind of relate to what you're doing? Like, you mentioned that you want to make money from wood carving. What are some other things that you're kind of using to diversify maybe your or support your creative journey?
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in really exactly what your title sort of communicates, that creative independence, and empowering more people to find that sense that they can go against the grain of a culture and produce something of their own. And so part of that leads me to things like web design. I've kind of developed my method of building websites that barely costs any money, but gives you a ton of creative freedom. And it's not complicated. It's basically utilizing modern AI tools combined with some fundamental knowledge of how websites actually function and web browsers. And I found it quite interesting to learn a bit about how computers work, how a web browser works, HTML and CSS. And growing up, my father worked in IT, so computers were around from a very young age, and we were shown how to use them. And when I asked my father at 11 years old, how does animation work? I see cartoons on TV. How does that work? I know, 100 years ago, Disney was drawing frame by frame, but that's not how it works now. And then my dad went and found some software, which at the time was Macromedia Flash, before Adobe took Flash and before it became obsolete. But
Yeah.
it had this built-in set of tutorials. And so I learned how to animate. Just basic stuff, making stick figures run around and get blown up and silly animations. And it was very fun. And so that gave me a little bit of sense of how the illusion of motion functions when it comes to animation. And then later I got interested in filmmaking a little bit, and it ties into magic as well. Like the early filmmakers were magicians. The people who found this new technology most interesting, they went from the art of illusion in terms of like stage illusions to producing this illusion of moving pictures. And so I've always been interested in like what's behind the scenes, what's behind the curtains. And when you look at a computer, especially now with AI, it seems to be doing things that are intelligent. And, you and I can see each other on our screens right now, but it's really just a bunch of pixels. And these pixels are producing wavelengths of light. And how is that happening? Well, there's a bunch of little tiny transistors basically that are doing extremely complicated arithmetic. And so at base, a computer isn't actually intelligent. It's running operations that reflect the intelligence of the people who created them. Or not just the individuals who created them, but almost like a collective intelligence, because the language we use was created by many, many generations of whole populations. So it's like there's this collective intelligence that's now being expressed through computers, but at the base, it's binary code. And so now most people using computers, if they want to build a website, they go to WordPress or they go to Squarespace or Wix, or maybe they use a modern vibe coding thing like Framer. But to me, it was really empowering to learn the basics of how to code and then use the AI tools like Cursor to build all the code, and then how to host that website for free, and to then bypass all of these platforms that charge you quite a bit of money to host a basic website. Is super empowering. I could build and launch a website in 30 minutes, and then iterate on it and improve it. And, within a week, I'd have like a professional quality website. And so that fits this whole theme for me of like, how can more people be empowered as individuals to not rely on all of these systems? And then there's, the woodworking is a similar thing. Like if I want a new spatula, well, I'm trying to avoid plastic. So how about I just carve my own spatula? Of course, why not? Like maybe it's going to take me more time than the factory-made spatula takes to make, but it's going to last me 30 years. So, and I can refinish it. Wood is nicely, easily refinished. And another interest, hopefully I can weave this all together nicely, but my wood art brand is called Oak Moss. And oak moss is actually a type of lichen. And so a lot of people probably don't know what lichen actually is. You've seen it. It's like on the sides of a tree, on the surface of a rock. You'll often see this sort of crusty looking, sort of moss-like organism. And it's actually a combination of a fungus and an algae. And so I was interested in fungi partly due to my experiences with psilocybin mushrooms,
Yeah.
which we can get into that as well. But altered states of consciousness impacted me in a beautiful way. And then I discovered not only the compounds in these magic mushrooms, but also fungi in general are fascinating beings. And we just see what is above the ground, the mushroom.
Yeah.
But under the ground is the mycelium, right? This web of threads, one cell wide threads that permeate the soil. And they're sending information, they're sending nutrients all over the place underground. And the mushroom is just the fruiting body of the fungus, sort of like an apple is to the tree. The mushroom is to the real body of the fungus. And so I learned a little bit about mushrooms in my early 20s, became interested in people like Paul Stamets, who's a ecologist, a mycologist who focuses on fungi specifically, and found out, a lot of mushrooms are the most powerful medicines. They can remediate landscapes that have been degraded. They can restore soil health. Really incredible beings. And so then I discovered lichen is this composite organism. And there's a word called, the word is symbiosis. And symbiosis is when more than one organism engages in a mutually beneficial relationship. And you could say it profits them both in some sense.
Yes.
And somehow, way, way, way back in time, before, probably before trees, because fungi made it to land before plants. And so lichens were this incredible discovery that some fungi and some algae made. And fungi are their own category, right? They're not plants and they're not animals. And then algae, it's a type of plant. So it's photosynthetic. It captures energy from the sun. And fungi, they don't do that. Fungi, they take in oxygen, more like an animal than a plant. And they get rid of carbon dioxide. And they aren't photosynthetic. They get their energy, I believe, like mostly from carbohydrates. They're getting nutrients from the ground. And so somehow they discovered that they worked well together. Certain types of fungi and certain types of algae, they discovered that they could create this new organism in a sense. It still has two separate genomes, but it kind of acts like one organism. And so it can live on the surface of a rock because the algae can capture the sunlight energy, and the fungal body is, I think it's mostly capturing nutrients from like moisture in the air. And they can live with very small amounts of moisture. Now, I'm no expert on lichen, but I became very interested in these types of strange biological strategies and like evolutionary biology and how these things function. And it was actually a total accident that I named my company Oak Moss. I just liked how it sounded. In fact, I was in a dollar store and I saw on a pen that had a camouflage pattern. It said Oak Moss, and it stuck in my head. And then after I named the wood art business Oak Moss, I found out it was a type of lichen. And then I realized, that's very congruent with sort of my art philosophy. And even the fact that I'm working with wood, I'm taking material from trees. And there's this incredibly interconnected relationship we have with our ecosystem. And we don't think about it. We live in these houses that are largely made of trees, and we're breathing oxygen that's largely emitted by plants. And so it's just very beautiful to me how we are these hopefully more symbiotic organisms. There's also plenty of parasitic relationships in nature, but
as in life.
Yeah, the goal would be that we can be more symbiotic,
Yeah.
and that we can mutually benefit each other. And I really like that concept, so it stuck, and it just worked for me with the wood art. And yeah, I hope to kind of reflect that in my creations, the beauty of these interconnections and the intelligence of nature.
Yeah. It seems to me that, well, first of all, I don't know if it's actually a coincidence that you have found the name oak moss. Uh, like, I'm not one to really believe in like destiny or something like that, but I'm always intrigued by those things. I have a clothing brand called Absurd, and I named it. I was like, that's an interesting name. And then, like, I think a month later, I watched a video on absurdism, and I was like, that makes a lot of sense. That's kind of how I see, like, I finally found kind of a philosophy that made sense for me. So I'm not too sure about being a coincidence, but and I think we'll tie all those things together. Maybe we'll get into a bit of um, Senkai, Senkai's, damn, um, I forgot the name. Senkaism? I don't know. Well, it's kind of the concept where all things have consciousness. I forget the name. Panpsychism. Is
Oh
that?
yeah, I
Yeah.
think
Well,
panpsychism. Yeah.
yeah, panpsychism. Anyway, but I will tie all those things together. But for me, it kind of seems like you you are always kind of following your curiosity and maybe your intuition in life, and you have maybe found a way to through creation to find meaning or to kind of justify all those years of pain and suffering that you mentioned. And I think this concept of lichen, uh, it also kind of makes sense with all the philosophy that you talked about and being a creator. How do you find meaning, and how do you find the creative role in making meaning? I'm always very interested in hearing from other people how they make meaning or how they find those answers to life, or rather, what are the questions that they're seeking to find an answer for, because you can find answers for almost everything. I think maybe it's about the question. So the question is, how do you make meaning, and kind of what are the answers that you found so far?
Wow. Yeah, this is one of the deepest questions, I think. And it's an old question.
It is.
And most cultures have their, let's say, maps of meaning. And to me, they're sort of like good enough approximations of truth for
Mm.
the context of the time, and yet they're always in need of update. They expire, and so we live in this very strange age, right? People sometimes call it like the postmodern era, or maybe we're passing that even now, but because we became this global village where we all know about all the other religions and all the other cultures, we can't subscribe to our own anymore, right? Whereas 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, whatever you were told to believe by the people close to you, it was much easier to believe because you had less contrast to compare it to. So we live in sort of a disoriented age, and it makes sense that absurdism speaks to a lot of people, because it seems like all of these maps have revealed themselves to be untrue. And so it's all sort of like, well, if they're only good enough approximations of true meaning, then at the bottom there must not be, some objectively true ultimate meaning to it all. And yeah, some people might be familiar with, for example, Nietzsche's statement that God is dead. And I think it was sort of like a proclamation that the Christianity of the time has been shown to be insufficient to reveal the answer to the question, what's the meaning of it all? And what do we do with that? When cultures, societies have always depended on these maps, how are we going to orient? How are we going to have a shared sense of reality and a shared value system? And so in my exploration of these types of ideas, like, exploring different cultural myths and religious ideas, and becoming interested in Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, who paid a lot of attention to the underlying structure in the stories behind all of these cultures, myths, and religious narratives. They discovered there was this heroic impulse, right? Like Campbell called it the hero myth, the hero with 1,000 faces. And so I have this sense that it's always necessary for some of the individuals in a culture to become the meaning makers. And it doesn't mean to do away with all the old maps and just discard them. Not necessarily. But it's a courageous impulse to update the culture. Because even in the same way that job security is a comforting, it's sort of a comforting illusion for most of society, someone had to create these jobs. Someone innovated. There's always innovators who are creating new ways of producing value so that the majority of people can live out those ways. And the meaning makers, I believe that in essence they have to go into the underworld where the map is disintegrated. The map doesn't help anymore. They have to discover something new in the unknown. And then they have to come back to their culture and somehow integrate it, somehow communicate what they've discovered. And then in these stories, generally, the person who does that is rejected at first.
Yes.
Right? And it's the stranger with the strange idea and anomalous information. We don't want to look at that. We want to adhere to our map. And at some point, it becomes clear enough that the map is no longer sufficient. And finally, the population notices that they're disoriented and they're looking for an answer. And then suddenly they notice the person who at first they had rejected, and they see that this person has something that they're looking for. And finally they're ready to listen. And so this is this story that kind of always repeats, and it repeats on the scale of a culture, and it repeats inside of us as individuals. Even in the hero myth, the hero usually also refuses to answer the call at one point. Because why would you leave the territory of the known? The known is safe, and the unknown is dangerous. But then at some point, The Shire is clearly threatened. And if we don't face this danger outside the Shire, then the Shire is doomed. So it's better to face the danger than to pretend it's not there. So I think it's a wonderful question that you're asking, because there is like a meaning crisis happening in modern times. And
Yes.
more and more people feel this disoriented confusion. And we're all sort of asking this question. How do we become reoriented? How do we find meaning? And it's certainly not an easy question to answer. So there's arguments, philosophical arguments about whether, can you create your own meaning? Can the Nietzschean Ubermensch or Superman really exist and create his own value structure? And I don't know that I have a clear answer to that. I think that to some capacity I've found a lot of meaning in I suppose the creative journey. It's sort of about updating perceptions. And so noticing that, people find positive. It's very difficult to answer, but
Yeah.
I find a lot of joy when I can help someone reorient their perceptions about their life.
Yeah.
And I think that is largely about personal meaning. And so if the map doesn't suffice to give a person meaning, maybe they leave the religion of their upbringing and they're disoriented. Or they leave an old career path behind. Or they just haven't found one yet. Well, we have to find something that's personally meaningful to us. And so I think, to some extent, religious ideas can actually help you orient in a way. You can read the Old Testament stories of these people who they actually lived out that hero myth to some extent, because they were called to do something that didn't make sense to the people around them. And yet they had to do it. It was the summons of their soul. And eventually it redeemed them. And it redeemed other people around them. And so I don't know if we can just make our own meaning from scratch. I think you were really onto something with what you said before you asked the question about how I've sort of been following my curiosity and following my intuition. And I believe that that is how we discover a relationship with meaning. So I think there is inherent meaning in life, but I don't think there's like one definable meaning that could be described once and for all and plant a flag in it. I think it's more like we have to build a relationship with being itself. And people define divinity and God in all these different ways, but I think to me it's about direct experience of having a relationship with being itself. And I believe that there's an impulse deep within us that, if we follow it, can help us orient toward what is meaningful. But I think it is beyond language.
Yeah, it's the splinter in the mind.
Yes.
We'll go into just like the philosophy of being, and I think we can get into Alan Watts a bit because he talks a fair bit about it. But before that, are you familiar with Ernest Becker, the anthropologist?
His name keeps popping up, but I don't quite remember what he's known
he
for.
wrote he wrote a book called The Denial of Death.
Oh, it was in your essay that I most recently
Yeah,
heard his name.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm reading Joseph Campbell, the hero with a thousand faces, because Ernest Becker mentions him, and he talks a lot about heroism and this heroic impulse that you mentioned. And I think he is like, his book is the closest I've got to an answer as well. And it really comes down to what you said, that it's very difficult to find a proper answer, or to actually even create one to begin with. And he states in the book that basically his thesis is that everything that we do to avoid death, and to avoid feeling insignificant, right? Because it's another type of death. It's a symbolic one. And the way we do that is creating immortality projects, or immortality systems in society. So that could be having children, that could be starting a company, or committing to a job, or having a project. All of these things, they kind of give meaning to us, because they in some sense make us immortal. And then you have like religion and other spiritual practices that kind of literally promise physical immortality. So his philosophy kind of goes around that, and I find that very compelling. But towards the end of the book, he goes into more of what the real problem is. And it's not that any of these answers is wrong per se, but really that the unexamined life is what we should avoid. So just taking those immortality systems and just accepting them without questioning, and without actually thinking, do I really believe like what I'm hearing from this person, or am I just too afraid to look into this because it will reveal how fragile I am, or how meaningless can life be? Or even like he describes the creatureliness of our own bodies, that we're strange creatures that do strange things. And he describes that we are worms and gods at the same time. Yeah. So it's a dichotomy that keeps on kind of bothering us, and if we don't examine life, we will just latch onto something. And he proposes that we shouldn't do that, and we should examine life and then like choose something. One of his ways is kind of the artist way of creating for oneself a project, or something to dedicate one's life to. And he goes on to talk about the two paths that one can do that. And one is kind of, creating a project, making the best use of its own abilities, and giving a gift to God, right? And then there is the kind of independent, or just the artist way, that doesn't give a gift to God because he doesn't believe in one. But that can also be a bit dangerous in his perspective, because you can also become too familiar with the world that you created and the meaning that you created, and you kind of start drinking your Kool-Aid and believing your own kind of meaning making system, and then you're back to to zero, right? Because you're not questioning anymore. So it is a valid path, he says, but it can fall into this system of kind of self validation or something like that. So I always find very interesting how people are always making their own meaning, but there isn't actually something to be made. It's more of a choice in the end, and it's more about how you deal with what you're choosing than the quality of that. Well, the quality does matter, I'd say, because you want to be happy and you want to enjoy life. But yeah, I don't know if I'm being circular here.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Fascinating. So is it Ernest Becker who's responsible for the term terror management theory?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, as I sort of alluded to this problem of the tension between terror management theory and the question of ultimate meaning. And terror management theory could lead someone to nihilism, right?
Yes.
To think, oh, all of our meaning structures, all of our meaning making is just a futile attempt to deal with this horrible problem of death. And that is very troubling. So there's an essay that I would really recommend, and I would love to talk with you about it if you read it, which is from Jordan Peterson, and it's titled "Three Forms of Meaning and the Management of Complexity." And he proposes a rebuttal to terror management theory.
Yeah, and I hear that he isn't very fond of it.
Yeah. Now, is his rebuttal sufficient? I'm not totally sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would love to further discuss this question with you as time goes on.
Yeah, for sure. So moving a bit to like philosophy and kind of your inspirations on, you said like Eastern philosophy. You and Dan talked a bit about Alan Watts in the podcast, and like
Yeah.
weirdly enough, Alan Watts was kind of the guy who kind of started me on the path of being, really, because I became very introspective after my autoimmune issue, and like I was too much in my head, and I had developed kind of the mental side of things a bit too much. So I really related to some of his lectures that I used to binge watch on YouTube, and then the channel that I was following just vanished, and I was sad. But how has Alan Watts shaped your thinking, and who else did, you would say?
Yeah. Alan Watts, quite a guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was an Anglican minister at one point in time, and then became one of the most talented communicators of Eastern philosophy in the West. And you probably know he sometimes referred to himself as a spiritual entertainer.
Yeah.
And, people wanted to almost consider him a guru, right?
Yeah.
And it's always a danger for people who are communicating spiritual ideas and maybe being a leader in some ways to potentially take on that position of being a guru. I think he handled that fairly well in his communicating. In his personal life, he was seemingly still maybe troubled in some respects, or maybe not. It's hard to know. People sometimes dismiss him because of the alcohol in his life. He drank quite a bit at times. And was that a problem? Well, it's up to you to decide, right? But his philosophical talks were incredible. Um, I don't think anyone has done a better job at simply explaining in an entertaining way the essence of Taoism or Zen. And it's all sort of funny and ironic, right? He would sometimes open a talk, let's say on Zen, by saying something like, if I were to address you in the real spirit of Zen, I would simply, smack my fan on the microphone and then leave. And yet you've gathered here expecting me to say something, so I will, so as not to disappoint you.
Yeah.
But, in the same way that one of the teachings in Buddhism, or the stories, is this teacher who sat in front of a congregation of sorts and just held his finger up until someone in the crowd finally cracked a smile and understood the teaching. And others were left disappointed. Isn't he going to teach us something? So Alan Watts, he would often, in some ways, produce something like a lengthy Zen koan. Right? In Zen, there's the tradition of the koan, which is sort of this story or language puzzle that is sort of designed to snap you out of it. Right? The Zen student goes to the teacher wanting some profound truth, and the teacher knows that there's nothing that can be said that will explain realization to the student. So there's all these stories of, students having their fingers chopped off and absurd, crazy stuff, and then becoming awakened. And so those would usually be very short stories that sort of are supposed to snap you out of trying to seek some logical answer, and instead realize presence of being. And Alan would go on these long speeches, an hour or two long talk that in some ways it's pointing out logical conclusions and things about reality, and yet he's pointing at something other than what language can really point at, right? Like the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. So language can only map onto reality so far.
Yeah.
Reality just is being. And as I'm speaking, the production of sound that I'm making is only a tiny little part of the actual being that's happening. So how could I possibly describe the presence of your awareness? And so Alan Watts, I feel like he brought me a lot of peace overall with his talks. And I read his book called The Book on the Taboo of Knowing Who You Are. And yeah, there's only so much I can really say. Sort of like what Dan talked about when we brought up Alan Watts was how when you're writing content online, sometimes it's really tempting to want to get across this deep concept or deep awareness, and yet you have to hook people's attention with something for them to even pay attention. So Dan kind of joked with me like, yeah, great, cool, deep, profound idea, but like Alan Watts could do it because he was charismatic in how he presented the ideas. He had his own unique style that was captivating and entertaining. So you have to find your way of communicating that interests people. Otherwise, you're just pointing at the moon and hoping people become awakened or something. And it's like, okay, great, you're holding your finger up. I don't get it.
Yeah. It's kind of the
Yeah.
trap of intellectualism, right?
Yeah.
Like you're almost kind of talking to yourself in the same wavelength that you would understand, but a lot of people wouldn't. And I don't really think like, well, I kind of have in my personal life that I cannot convince anyone of anything. So I just kind of try and listen, and if something kind of sparks, I just, you know, uh, if I have to say something, I'll say it, but with no expectation of convincing someone. Um, but it's always kind of fascinating for me how we were talking about philosophy and all these very big thoughts, but it all comes down to experience and um, being, really, because even if you were to kind of intellectualize experience, like all that you see, all like your perception and sensations are built in the brain or in the mind, are constructed in the mind. You don't actually see things with your eyes. Like you see with your brain, your eyes just happen to capture sensations. So really, all that you have that you call reality is experience. So can you really ask something more of it than experience, than being, than um, you know, it's kind of fascinating for me, and it's a bit of a dichotomy as well, because we were talking about kind of creating meaning, and that seems a bit opposite. I wonder how those two things integrate, though. How this experience and being okay with um, not finding answers, and also kind of creating your own reality. Do you have any thoughts on that? It's a difficult question.
Yeah, I don't know if I could do much better than the old, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. I haven't got into much about Buddhism and Taoism, and a lot of people have been recommending Hinduism as well for me. Do you have any books recommendations for these topics? Like, what are the books kind of that inspired your thinking? You mentioned Alan Watts' book that I haven't read as well. I'm fairly like uneducated on Eastern philosophy. I just happen to like, and I heard a fair bit of things.
Yeah, well, Alan Watts sort of came out of this era uh, where there was the whole psychedelic revolution happening. And so, mostly in the 60s, everyone knows of the hippies, but there was also, aside from the hippies, there was some more academic and really a lot of very thoughtful people. Um, and most people know of Timothy Leary, who became quite a media personality. But out of that same era came Richard Alpert, who later became known as Ram Dass. And both of these fellas were sort of after the beatniks. So in the 1950s, there were the beatnik writers. Jack Kerouac became known for his novels like On the Road. or the Dharma Bums. And Allen Ginsberg was friends with Jack Kerouac, as well as Gary Snyder. Gary Snyder, I believe, is still standing, or at the very least sitting. He's in his elder years, but one of the last remaining beatniks from those days. And they all produced a lot of very influential literature. And after the beatniks came the hippies, and sort of in between was Ken Kesey of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But what I would suggest, especially if you are interested in learning more about Hinduism, which I'm not very educated about, I think it's quite an elaborate religious system. I have read the Bhagavad Gita, which is just a section of their larger mythos, I guess. Like there's a much longer epic text, and I don't know if I know how to say it properly. I think it's like the Mahabharata. And the Bhagavad Gita is just a section of it. And it contains a story that I would suggest looking at how Ram Dass talks about the Bhagavad Gita. He describes how it can be meant to be read in 3 different perspectives. So you read it once, taking on a certain perspective, like you sort of identify with a certain character. And then you read it again a little differently. And then you read it a 3rd time, taking on a different perspective. And this sort of creates this whole picture, or it's supposed to cultivate a sort of awareness. And yeah, I've had some level of influence on me from the Bhagavad Gita. And then Ram Dass, he wrote a book called Be Here Now. And actually he did a talk that someone turned into that book, Be Here Now. And I would suggest not trying to find an audio version of it or like getting the actual book. It's full of these incredible illustrations. Every page is this visual experience with some text on it. Be Here Now is a wonderful book. And yeah, aside from that, all of that literature sort of influenced me in a roundabout way. I had a teacher in university who spent some time with some of those beatnik authors like Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder and learned quite a bit from them. They were also poets. And so poetry is of interesting relevance to my work, partly because when I landed in that university class with Professor Trevor Carolan, is his name, I started speculating on how plants could be teachers. And this was partly because of my experiences with psilocybin and my interest in things like ayahuasca, which I haven't experienced. Have experienced cactus medicine like Huachuma or San Pedro, which contains mescaline. Some people might know of Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, originally catalyzed by his experience with mescaline. And Huxley kind of comes out of that same era to an extent, but more of an academic background. He was very much an academic. So when he wrote The Doors of Perception, that was a very influential book. His grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, was an evolutionary biologist, an early defender of Charles Darwin's ideas. The whole Huxley family is quite interesting to investigate. But poetry ties into the very structure of how language becomes meaningful in the first place. So maybe this even ties into the whole hero myth sort of thing and the direct experience, direct awareness. Trevor Carolan had his poetic philosophy influenced by these beatnik writers like Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, who were very interested in ecological attention, paying attention to your direct experience, noticing what you notice. Allen Ginsberg's description of mindfulness is to notice what you notice. And so he would produce these little snapshots in the form of poetry. And that tradition goes way back. The haiku and the poetry of, I think he went by Cold Mountain or Han Shan. Little snapshots, beautiful little snapshots of noticing what he noticed in nature. And poetry seems to be tied into the very roots of language. So Ralph Waldo Emerson said every word was once a poem, or everyday language is fossilized poetry. And so we used words that we somehow learned as toddlers and children and later, but we learned language. How did we learn language? Well, we moved our bodies around and stumbled around, and then people made sounds and they pointed at things. And language wasn't just this disembodied, symbols on a page, right? It's very embodied. And we experience meaning sort of before language, right? If you fall down and get hurt, pain is inherently a meaningful signal to the brain. And so, yeah, poetry seems to be what is at the foundation, metaphor, spontaneous production of metaphorical expression. I don't remember what question I'm answering right now, but yeah,
Me neither.
the early beatnik writers, and some of the literature that came out of the psychedelic movement, like Ram Dass, I would recommend.
Nice. You said something about poetry, and I remember that one of the things that Alan Watts talked about that kind of most impacted me back then was his description of dance and like, why do we dance? Because it doesn't have a kind of a finish line. Like, the goal is not to like rush to the finish line, is to kind of enjoy oneself while you're doing it. And maybe that ties back into what we were talking about, creating meaning, but also experiencing reality. Because poetry and dancing, there's the part of skill they can kind of cultivate, but there's also the experience, and you cannot have, well, you can have one without the other, but it's not very enjoyable, right? Maybe that's, well, our Lord and Savior Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi would call flow state. That's very interesting. I haven't made that connection until now. Yeah, man. I feel like we have so much to talk about, honestly.
Well, I like what you just put together very much. Flow states are a state of unself-consciousness. Not dancing to make a show of it, but for the experience itself. And then also you brought up skill, and flow states are catalyzed when there's a good match between skill level and difficulty level. And so I'm not a talented dancer, but I could get into a flow state by just moving around spontaneously, dancing more easily if no one's watching.
Yeah.
But if you can do that when other people are watching, you enter this state of unself-consciousness. And that's one of the big questions, I think, is how much are we trying to produce meaning to portray something to others? And how much are we leaning into like our direct experience of the moment? And both have their purpose, right? We want to communicate with each other and say something that's like meaningful to somebody else. But then that puts us into performance mode and portrayal mode, and can make us kind of rigidly attached to our identity, right?
Yeah.
Trying to portray my identity as some consistent self. And yet I'm a mystery unto myself. And so I think that's a beautiful way to put it. If you can enter that flow state, you're sort of unblocking the channel to that spontaneous expression of new meaning and awareness, direct awareness. You're very alert. Flow states also necessitate some level of risk, right? If you're, I'm a little bit of a climber. Sometimes I go to the bouldering gym and climb, and it's not that dangerous to fall, but you're alert. You don't want to fall, so it demands your consciousness is at attention, and it's very easy for us to just become creatures of habit, and that's where language becomes fossil poetry, because it's useful enough to get by. I can just go through the motions. I can follow the patterns of my culture. I can follow my habits, and I can kind of go through life without being that alert, and then not really produce new meaning. That can be that sort of unfulfilling path where I just feel like I'm going through the motions. I'm just trying to live up to a social identity. But when I really feel alive is when I'm not self-conscious, and instead I'm just enjoying the dance for what it is. Like you're twirling on one foot, trying not to fall, right? Or I always enjoyed riding a unicycle as a kid and juggling. Those are things where it's like it just demands so much awareness in the moment. You can't really be thinking about the past and the future.
Yeah.
And so then you're fully aware of the only real thing, which is the present moment.
That's
And I
awesome.
think that's what most of these spiritual teachings, especially the Eastern teachings, seem to point at, is
Yeah.
the present moment.
Yeah, man. That's a bit of a thing that I'll admit that it's missing a bit in my life right now. And I think this conversation is a good reminder of it. Um, it was fun when you accepted to jump in a podcast, because I kind of remembered all these things about Alan Watts. I used to listen to Sadhguru Guru as well. Um, I'm not too familiar with him, but it was very interesting to hear about experience and being and this kind of cultivation of, I don't know if contentment is the right word, but satisfaction maybe. And it's a thing that I kind of think I pushed off a bit in my life right now, but it's always good to come back to, and maybe that's part of, the road to becoming a unblocked creator, and conquering your creative independence. It's not a road that can only be followed through a single path like that. It's well, we're getting too abstract now, but it's a road that has kind of two levels to it, or more than two. I don't know. Well, we're heading to almost time, and I think, dude, I could go on for hours, honestly. I wanted to get into a bit more on your psychedelic experiences, and a bit more on the kind of structures of education and the system, quote unquote. But I don't think we'll make it. But we'll save that for another time. I just wanted to kind of talk about, you mentioned the future proof event, and I think it ties kind of all that we discussed here back to being a creator. And now we have kind of this understanding that it's not just a content creator, but kind of a shaper of reality, or it's both things, right? So how is the event? How?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you about these things. I think that starting this podcast is going to be a very exciting journey for you to explore these types of questions and flow states. I think that conversing on podcast is a great way to do it because you get to sort of dance back and forth between those modes where you're sort of getting analytical on one level, but you're also dancing the dance and
Yeah.
enjoying the flow. So I think that's going to be a very exciting journey for you to continue. And for this opportunity also to share about this event, because actually it does tie into everything we've talked about. And in-person events have been a lot of fun for me, and they've been very significant in my educational path. So way back in my magic days as a child, from age 10 to 15, I attended a lot of magic conventions. And, you know, you can go on YouTube or buy a book and learn some of the secrets of magic, or I was lucky enough to have a mentor. But when I became part of the Vancouver Magic Circle and the International Brotherhood of Magicians, I got to spend a lot of time in whole groups of people attending magic lectures and being immersed in that crowd, where instead of just learning like, oh, here's the secret to this card trick, or here's the secret to this rope trick, it was more, there's deeper secrets to get access to. And so it's like, how about the secrets of how to be a performer on stage presenting a magic trick, to entertain, not just to show a card trick, but how to speak in front of a crowd, how to get gigs, how to be a professional magician, how to get jobs. There's all kinds of levels of secrets, so to say, to any given type of magic. So mastering a craft, there would be like guilds in the ancient days where you join up with a guild and you're learning the secrets, you're learning the magic of the craft. And that would be through apprenticeship. And so there's a lot more to it than what you can read in a book. And I would say the same is true for, let's say, being a content creator or whatever type of creator. To me, it was so impactful to go to those magic conventions. Those are like core memories for me. And then, as you said, I think the whole psychedelic discussion can come up in another conversation in the future. But when I had those early psychedelic experiences, I felt kind of alone and misunderstood by the people close to me. And then I found the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference happening in Vancouver in 2016, so 10 years ago now. And I attended that, and I met like 300 people. Some of them were scientists, some of them were professional therapists, some of them were just people like me who were young explorers trying to find meaning in life. And they found that eating some mushrooms was a profound experience. So suddenly, I wasn't alone. It was credible. I was surrounded by people who understood. This is something real. And my parents one day came to that conference with me, and they were a little less worried after that. They understood, oh, there's people actually implementing psychedelics in therapy. Very credible research happening. Very profound healing taking place. And so I would say mushrooms helped me quit smoking. I would say mushrooms, to some degree, helped me come to terms with my mortality. And mushrooms have helped me on this meaning-making journey. So it was so profound to find myself in a room with hundreds of other people who understood that. This is something valid. And so then, about 6 months ago, I was meeting regularly with a group of writers online, and most of us influenced by people like Dan Coe, who is, the one of the great philosophers of the modern creator economy. His work is very impressive. His book, Purpose and Profit, I would highly recommend to everybody who's seeking an entrepreneurial path. It's a good little collection of essays, as well as his book, The Art of Focus. But through my writing, and as Dan was developing his software, which is now called Eden, I was getting noticed by him. And then we ended up in contact, and then we ended up becoming fairly well acquainted, and we've gotten together in person now a couple of times. And so 6 months ago, I thought I would like there to be an in-person event for the creator economy. And I know there's lots of different events out there. There's different entrepreneurial summits and creator events around the world. But Dan's audience is quite unique in that he's kind of taken a lot of people who are very philosophically oriented, searching for deeper meaning in life, and showed them very practical business skills. And, also like fitness is big for him. So fitness, business, and philosophy all intertwined very nicely into some very clear pathways of how to find your way as a creator. And so I really appreciate Dan for that. And I reached out to him and said, hey, we want to do an in-person conference in Vancouver, and we'd like you to come. And he was immediately very supportive of the idea. He said, I'll be there. And then I got in contact with some others, like Dan Goldfield and Brian Meyerhofer, Kimi Honora. There's a list of speakers who all said, yes, count me in. And this is incredible because this is a first-time event, and most of these speakers, they've done very well with their work online, and they've produced an income doing work that's meaningful to them, but they haven't done a lot of public speaking on stage. So they all saw it as kind of an opportunity and a great chance to get together. So instead of asking for a speaker fee, which, someone like, Gary Vaynerchuk, who's done lots of public speaking, would charge a lot of money to speak at an event, generally. All of these people I reached out to were just excited about the idea. And, as long as I said I'd cover some travel expense, they said, count me in. So that's very exciting. And the way I see it, I sort of cultivated this tribe of mentors for myself, and I'm looking to bring as many people as possible with me on this journey. How can we unblock as many creators as possible? How can we allow as many people to find creative independence and to make a pathway for themselves that is more fulfilling and maybe redeems them from this state of disoriented confusion that we've talked about. And to me, like, working in an office cubicle for 40 years was always not an option. And so I know there's a lot of other people who are wanting to find a different way. And the creator economy presents this incredible time of opportunity for entrepreneurship to be more accessible, right? So I've started building a reasonable sized audience and building some community and all these incredible relationships, someone like you inviting me on their podcast, but it hasn't required a lot of startup capital, right? For me, it's really just required that I keep my expenses as low as possible to have a lot of free time. But even if you have a full-time job, Dan created the 2-hour writer for that reason. If you can find 1 or 2 hours a day to start, carving out time for your meaningful creative work, that will eventually compound into something that allows you to become free from, if you're not happy with employment, then to become free from it. So that's the goal, is to invite people to get immersed in this tribe of people who are either teaching what they've learned by getting fairly far in the creator economy, or who are still just fighting for it, like you and I, and trying to figure out how are we going to build something um, fulfilling and meaningful, and give our gifts to the world, and find out what do we have to offer. Everyone has something beautiful to offer, and everyone has the potential to unleash creativity in their lives, and it's just so fulfilling, and it'll improve the world, right? The more people who find access to that, um, and give their gifts to the world, we all benefit from that. We all benefit when someone profits by producing value for others. So that's what we're doing. We're meeting in Vancouver this June. The event is called the Future Proof Creator Summit, and June 5th to 7th. So it's 3 days long. It begins at 1 o'clock on the Friday, and it ends at about 4 p.m. on the Sunday. And there'll be a bunch of incredible keynote presentations from our speakers, and there will be a bunch of opportunities to play some games and network with each other and find your tribe. So that's the idea, man.
That's awesome.
People can find out all they need to know about that at thelivinginternet.com. And yeah, that's where I would send them to find out more.
Awesome, man. Is it in Vancouver, you said?
Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And it's
That's
the
awesome.
Sheraton Vancouver Airport Hotel, which is about 10 minutes from the airport. There's a free shuttle for hotel guests to get to the venue.
Awesome. I hope there's not a lot of echo right now because my headphone just died.
Oh,
But
okay. Yeah.
that's incredible, man. I'm so happy for you and so happy for the event. It's something that I wish I could go, and maybe I'll find a way. Who knows? Um, and I think it's of like utmost importance for creators because personally I have felt always very kind of lonely creating alone, right? There wasn't like I didn't have many friends that were creating as well as ambitiously, you could say, as I was. And it's always good to surround yourself with not only other people who are building, but people who know more than you that have reached a different level, you could say, and kind of network with those people and get to know, as you said, the secrets that come with experience, because you cannot learn everything through just reading books and watching YouTube videos. And that's why community is important. That's why having creators is important, and becoming a creator is important. So I think you're doing a wonderful work for the world. So
Hey, thank you. Very honored to have been invited on your show and grateful to know you. So I'll look forward to all of our future conversations.
yeah, man, same. So just again, real quick, where can people find you? Your social media?
Yeah, so I am the Unblocked Carver, which is the title of my Substack publication. I can be found on YouTube, Jesse James Carver. And where else can I be found? If people would like to see my wood creations, they can go to oakmoss.ca. Oak like the tree, moss like the plant, .ca. And then for the event, thelivinginternet.com. And that's where all my main work can be found.
Incredible. So that was Jesse James, everybody. Thank you for listening, and until the next episode. Thank you,
Until
Jesse.
next time.